Do you feel lost? Listen to what God has to say to you. What if the reason you feel lost right now has nothing to do with failure, bad decisions, or lack of direction, and everything to do with a voice you stopped listening to without even realizing it? You wake up and follow the same rhythm every day. You move through your responsibilities, your conversations, your plans, doing everything you are supposed to do. From the outside, nothing seems broken. Nothing looks out of place. But inside, there is something you cannot ignore anymore. A quiet sense that something is missing, even when everything appears to be working. It is not a dramatic feeling. It does not always come with pain or panic. Sometimes it feels like a subtle emptiness, a space that no achievement seems to fill. You try to explain it logically. Maybe you think you need a new goal, a better routine, a different environment. So you adjust, you push forward, you keep building. But no matter how much you improve the outside, that same quiet feeling keeps returning. And the hardest part is this: you cannot clearly explain it to anyone. Because on paper, your life might even look good. People might look at you and think you are on the right path. But deep down, you feel disconnected from something you cannot fully name, so you try to silence it. You distract yourself. You fill your time so there is no space left to think too deeply. Because every time you slow down, that feeling comes back. Not louder, but clearer. As if it has been waiting for you to finally pay attention. Most people spend years running from this moment. They keep themselves busy enough to avoid asking the real question. Not what should I do next, but what am I not hearing? Because here is something most people never consider. Feeling lost is not always a sign that you are going in the wrong direction. Sometimes it is the exact moment when your life becomes quiet enough for something greater to finally reach you. The world teaches you to react faster, to think louder, to move constantly. But there is another way of being guided that does not compete with noise. It waits for stillness. It waits for attention. And if you are here right now, feeling this in a way that you cannot ignore anymore, then this is not random. This is not just another moment passing by. Because what if you are not lost? What if you are being called to finally listen? The silent cry you don't even notice. There is a part of you that has been trying to get your attention for a long time, but it does not use words, and that is exactly why it is so easy to overlook. It does not interrupt your day in obvious ways. It does not demand your focus. Instead, it stays in the background, quietly shaping how you feel, without ever fully revealing itself. You notice it in small moments. When everything is calm and you should feel at peace, but something feels slightly off. When you achieve something you once wanted, but the satisfaction fades faster than expected. When you are surrounded by people, yet a part of you feels distant, as if you are not fully present in your own life. This is not weakness. This is not a lack of gratitude. This is something deeper, something most people misinterpret or completely ignore. You have been taught that a cry for help needs to be obvious, that it should look like stress, anxiety, or visible struggle. But the deepest cries do not look like that. They are silent. They are subtle. They are persistent in a way that does not force you to act, but slowly invites you to notice. So you keep moving. You tell yourself this feeling will pass. You try to stay productive, to stay focused, to stay in control. Because stopping feels uncomfortable. Slowing down feels risky. If you pause too long, you might have to face something you do not fully understand. But what if this feeling is not something to escape? What if it is something trying to guide you? There is a difference between being lost and being disconnected. When you are lost, you do not know where to go. But when you are disconnected, you have direction available to you. You just cannot hear it clearly. And that is where most people are without realizing it. Surrounded by options, full of possibilities, but internally disconnected from the one thing that brings clarity. The world gives you endless voices, opinions, expectations, comparisons, constant input telling you what to do, how to think, who to become. And slowly, without noticing, you start listening to all of it. You start making decisions based on noise instead of truth. And in the middle of all that noise, something inside you goes quiet. Not because it disappeared, but because it is being ignored. That silent cry you feel is not random. It is not meaningless. It is not something to fix quickly so you can move on. It is a signal that something within you is trying to reconnect with something greater than your current understanding. And this is where the shift begins to happen. Because if this feeling is not the problem, then avoiding it might be the real mistake. And if you stay with this long enough to truly face it, you are going to realize something that most people never allow themselves to see. The problem is not that God is not speaking. The problem is everything else you have been choosing to listen to instead. When everything works, but nothing feels right. There comes a moment when your life starts to look exactly the way it was supposed to, at least from the outside. You are doing what you planned, following the path that once made sense, checking the boxes that were meant to bring fulfillment. And yet, something inside you refuses to align with that image. You wake up and go through your routine, but there is no real connection to it. The actions are there, the structure is there, but the meaning feels distant. It is not that you hate your life. It is that you cannot fully feel it the way you thought you would. This is where confusion starts to grow, because nothing is clearly wrong. There is no obvious crisis forcing you to stop. If anything, things might even be working. And that is what makes it harder to understand. You begin to question yourself. Maybe you are expecting too much. Maybe this is just how life feels after a certain point. Maybe fulfillment is not supposed to last. So you push those thoughts aside and keep moving forward, hoping that something will eventually click. But it never fully does. The truth is, when everything works but nothing feels right, it is not a sign that you need more from the outside. It is a sign that something inside you is no longer aligned with the direction you are following. And that realization is uncomfortable, because it challenges everything you have been building. You start to feel a quiet resistance toward things you once accepted without question. Goals that used to excite you now feel empty. Paths that once seemed clear now feel forced. And the more you try to ignore it, the more persistent that feeling becomes. This is where most people make a critical mistake. They assume the solution is to adjust the surface, change the plan, set new goals, create a different routine. But the deeper issue remains untouched. Because this is not about what you are doing. It is about what is guiding you. There is a difference between building a life based on what makes sense and building a life based on what is true. What makes sense can be influenced by expectations, by pressure, by comparison. But what is true connects with something deeper, something that does not come from the outside. When that connection is missing, everything can function and still feel empty. And here is the part most people avoid facing. You can spend years doing the right things for the wrong reasons, and from the outside, it will still look like success. But internally, it will always feel incomplete. That feeling you are experiencing is not failure. It is awareness. It is the moment when you begin to see that functioning is not the same as living with purpose. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. The question is no longer, how do I fix this quickly? The question becomes, what have I been building my life on this entire time? And if that question makes you uncomfortable, it is because you are getting closer to something real. Because the moment you realize that everything working is not the same as everything being right, you are no longer able to settle for surface-level answers. You start searching for something deeper. But what you are about to discover next will challenge even more of what you thought was true. Because it is not just about what you are doing. It is about the illusion that you were ever fully in control of it. The illusion of being in control. You were taught that control is strength. That if you plan carefully, think ahead, and stay disciplined, You can shape your life exactly the way you want it. And for a while, that belief seems to work. You set goals, you make decisions, you see results. It feels like progress, like direction, like certainty. But slowly, something begins to shift. The more you try to control everything, the more pressure you start to feel. Every decision carries weight. Every outcome feels like it depends entirely on you. And without noticing, what once felt empowering begins to feel exhausting. You start overthinking things that used to be simple. You question every step before taking it. You try to predict outcomes, avoid mistakes, eliminate uncertainty. Because if you can just manage everything correctly, then nothing should go wrong. But life does not respond to control the way you expect it to. Things change without warning. Plans fall apart. Opportunities appear in places you did not anticipate. And no matter how prepared you are, there are moments that do not follow your logic. This is where the illusion begins to crack. Control gives you the feeling of security, but it also creates a hidden fear. The fear that if you let go, everything will fall apart. So you hold on tighter. You try to manage more, fix more, anticipate more. And at the same time, that quiet feeling of being lost starts to grow stronger. Because control can organize your actions, but it cannot give you clarity of purpose. You can build a structured life and still feel internally disconnected. You can make all the right moves and still feel uncertain about why you are making them. That is because control focuses on outcomes, not alignment. It keeps your attention on what you can manipulate instead of what you are meant to understand. And here is the deeper truth that most people resist. The need for control often replaces the need for trust. Instead of listening, you calculate. Instead of allowing, you force. Instead of being guided, you try to dominate every step of the process. And for a while, it feels like you are moving forward. But eventually, you reach a point where effort is no longer enough. Where pushing harder does not bring more clarity. Where thinking more does not bring better answers. That is the moment where control stops working. Not because you failed, but because you were never meant to carry everything on your own. There is a kind of direction that does not come from planning. A kind of clarity that does not come from analysis. A kind of peace that does not come from certainty. But as long as you are holding on to control, you cannot access it. Because control fills the space where something greater is trying to enter. And letting go does not mean losing direction. It means creating space to finally receive it. That idea is uncomfortable because it challenges everything you have relied on to feel safe. But if you are honest with yourself, you already feel it. You already know that no matter how much you try to control, something is still missing. And what you are about to see next will make that even clearer. Because it is not just about control, it is about all the voices you allowed to replace the one that actually matters. The noise that feels like guidance. You are constantly surrounded by voices telling you what to do, how to think, and who to become. Some of them sound convincing. Some of them sound logical. Some of them even sound like truth. And over time, without realizing it, you begin to treat that noise as if it were guidance. It starts subtly. You listen to opinions, you compare your life to others, you absorb advice from people who seem confident in what they are saying. You scroll, you watch, you read, and piece by piece, those external inputs begin to shape your internal decisions. At first, it feels helpful. It gives you direction, structure, a sense of movement. It makes you feel like you are not alone in figuring things out. But something begins to shift. The more you listen, the less clear things become. You start hearing different perspectives that contradict each other. One voice tells you to be patient, another tells you to act now. One tells you to follow passion, another tells you to be practical. One tells you to trust yourself, another tells you that you are not doing enough. And suddenly, instead of clarity, you feel overwhelmed. Because noise does not guide, it competes. It pulls your attention in multiple directions at the same time. making it harder to recognize what actually resonates with something deeper inside you. And the most dangerous part is this. Some of that noise sounds exactly like what you want to hear. It confirms your fears, justifies your delays, or pushes you into decisions that feel urgent but are not truly aligned. It gives you the illusion of direction, while quietly disconnecting you from something more stable and more real. You begin to make choices based on what feels immediate instead of what feels true. You react instead of listening. You move, but without a clear sense of why. And in the middle of all that movement, that feeling of being lost starts to intensify. Because deep down, you can sense the difference. There is a difference between something that pressures you and something that grounds you. Between something that rushes you and something that centers you. Between something that fills your mind and something that settles your spirit. But to notice that difference, you need space. And that is exactly what noise takes away from you. It keeps you occupied, distracted, constantly processing, so you never reach the stillness where real guidance becomes clear. This is why so many people keep searching but never feel certain. They are not lacking information. They are surrounded by too much of it. And when everything is speaking at once, the most important voice becomes the hardest one to hear. Not because it is weak, but because it does not compete. It does not force your attention. It does not rush your decisions. It does not overwhelm your thoughts. It waits. And if you are always filling your mind with noise, you will miss it. So the question is no longer whether you are being guided. The question is what you are allowing to guide you. Because if the wrong voices are shaping your direction, then even the right path will start to feel confusing. And what you are about to realize next goes even deeper than that. Because this did not start with the noise. It started the moment you began to drift without noticing. The moment you started drifting. There was a moment when this did not feel this way. A moment when things were simpler. Not because life was easier, but because something inside you was clearer. You did not question everything. You did not carry this constant weight of uncertainty. There was a sense of direction that did not need to be explained. It was just there. And then slowly, something changed. Not all at once. Not in a way that was obvious. It did not feel like a sudden break or a dramatic shift. It felt gradual, almost unnoticeable. One decision at a time, one distraction at a time, one moment of ignoring that inner pull at a time. You started choosing what made sense over what felt true. You started prioritizing what was expected over what was aligned. You started listening more to what was around you than to what was within you. And none of that felt wrong in the moment. In fact, it often felt responsible, logical, necessary. You adapted, you adjusted, you kept moving forward. From the outside, it looked like growth. But internally, something began to fade. That sense of connection you once had became quieter. That inner clarity you once trusted became harder to access. Not because it disappeared, but because it was no longer being followed. And this is how drifting begins. Not through rebellion, not through failure, but through small disconnections that seem harmless at first. You ignore a feeling here. You delay a decision there. You tell yourself you will come back to it later. But later keeps getting pushed further away. Until eventually, you do not even remember what it felt like to be fully connected. And then one day, you look at your life and something feels off. You cannot point to a single mistake. You cannot identify a clear moment where everything went wrong. But you feel the distance. Distance from clarity, distance from purpose, distance from something that once felt natural. That is when the confusion starts to surface. Because now you are trying to find your way back, but you are searching from a place that no longer feels familiar. And here is the part most people struggle to accept. You did not drift because you were careless. You drifted because you adapted. You responded to pressure, to expectations, to the need to survive, to fit in, to move forward. You did what made sense in the moment, based on what you had and what you knew. But adaptation without awareness can slowly lead you away from alignment. And the longer it goes unnoticed, the more normal it starts to feel. Until being disconnected becomes your baseline, until confusion feels like your default state, until you begin to believe that this is just how life is supposed to be. But it is not. That feeling of being lost is not your natural state. It is the result of distance. And distance can be changed. But not by doing more of what led you here. Not by forcing clarity or chasing direction harder. Because if drifting happened quietly, then realignment does not begin with noise. It begins with awareness, with recognizing that something shifted, even if you cannot fully explain when or how. And once you see that, something else becomes clear. If you were able to drift without noticing, then you might also be missing something else right now. Something just as important. Because what feels like distance might not be what you think it is. And what you are about to understand next will challenge the idea that you have been left on your own. Why God feels distant but isn't. At some point, the question becomes unavoidable. If God is real, if God cares, if God is present, then why does He feel so far away? You look at your life, at your thoughts, at your current state, and it feels like there is a gap, a space between where you are and where you believe you should be. And in that space, it is easy to assume silence means absence. It feels logical. If you cannot hear, if you cannot feel, if you cannot clearly see direction, then maybe there is nothing there. Maybe you have been left to figure things out on your own. But that assumption comes from how you have been conditioned to understand connection. You expect clarity to be loud. You expect guidance to be obvious. You expect answers to come in ways that remove all doubt, because that is how most things in the world operate. But God does not compete with noise. And that changes everything. The feeling of distance is not always created by absence. Many times it is created by interference. Think about it carefully. If something constant is speaking, but your attention is divided, distracted, or overwhelmed, the result will feel the same as silence. Not because nothing is being said, but because you are not in a position to receive it. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. You interpret the lack of clarity as lack of presence. You interpret your confusion as abandonment. You interpret your emotional state as proof that something greater is not there. But what if none of that is true? What if the distance you feel is not about God stepping away, but about everything else stepping in? Every distraction, every expectation, every voice that you allowed to shape your focus has slowly filled the space where connection happens. And over time, that space became harder to access. Not gone, just buried. Because presence does not disappear just because it is not noticed. It remains. And this is the part that shifts everything. God does not move in and out of your life based on how connected you feel. That connection is not built on emotion. It is not dependent on perfect clarity or constant certainty. It exists whether you recognize it or not. But recognizing it requires something most people avoid. Stillness. Not external silence, but internal stillness. A space where you are no longer reacting to everything around you. A space where you are no longer trying to control, fix, or analyze every detail. Because as long as your mind is full, there is no room to receive. And that is why God can feel distant even when He is not. Not because He left, but because there has been no space to notice He is still there. This is not about trying harder. It is not about forcing belief or pretending to feel something you do not. It is about removing what is in the way. And that requires a different kind of awareness, the kind that does not look outward for more answers, but inward for what has been overlooked. Because the moment you begin to create that space, something changes. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that feels undeniable. Clarity does not arrive as noise. It arrives as something steady, something calm, something that does not need to prove itself to be real. And what you are about to see next will make that even clearer, because it is not just about whether God is present. It is about how He has been communicating with you this entire time without you realizing it. The language God uses that most ignore. You have been waiting for clarity to arrive in a way that is impossible to miss. Something direct, something undeniable, something that removes all doubt at once. But what if the reason it has not happened that way is because that is not how God usually speaks? There is a language being used, but it does not follow the patterns you were taught to expect. It does not force your attention. It does not interrupt your life in obvious ways. It does not compete with the noise around you. Instead, it moves quietly, consistently, and often in ways that are easy to overlook if you are not paying attention in the right way. It shows up as a sense of peace that does not match your circumstances. In moments where everything should feel uncertain, yet something inside you feels steady. Not excited, not emotional, just calm in a way that does not need explanation. It shows up as resistance that you cannot logically justify. Paths that look right on the outside but feel heavy when you try to follow them. Not fear, not insecurity, but a subtle weight that does not go away no matter how much you try to convince yourself. It shows up as interruptions, plans that do not unfold the way you expected, delays that frustrate you, closed doors that do not make sense at the time. You see them as obstacles, but what if they are protection? Because not every closed door is rejection. Some are direction. It also shows up in timing, opportunities that appear when you are not looking for them. Conversations that shift your perspective at the exact moment you needed it. Small moments that feel ordinary on the surface, but carry a deeper sense of meaning when you reflect on them. But here is why most people miss it. They are not looking for something subtle. They are looking for something loud. They are waiting for certainty before they move, when in reality, guidance often comes in a form that requires trust before confirmation. And that creates hesitation, because subtle guidance demands attention. It requires you to slow down, to notice, to feel, without immediately analyzing or dismissing what you are experiencing. It asks you to trust something that cannot always be explained in words. And in a world that values logic above everything else, that kind of trust feels uncomfortable. So you ignore it. You override that sense of peace because it does not make sense. You push through that resistance because it does not fit your plan. You get frustrated with interruptions because they delay what you think should happen. And without realizing it, you begin to move against the very direction you have been asking for. Not because it is not there, but because it does not look the way you expected. This is where everything starts to shift. Because once you understand that guidance is not always loud, you begin to pay attention differently. You stop waiting for overwhelming signs and start noticing consistent patterns. You stop asking for answers that remove all doubt and start recognizing what brings clarity without pressure. You begin to see that the language being used has always been present. It was just never meant to compete with noise. And that realization changes how you respond to everything. Because now the question is no longer, why am I not being guided? The question becomes, where have I been ignoring it? And that question leads you somewhere deeper. Because if the guidance has always been there, then something else must be preventing you from fully receiving it. Something that goes beyond distraction. Something that feels even harder to face. Because what you are about to confront next is not about what you hear. It is about why you have been avoiding the silence where that voice becomes clear. The fear of slowing down. There is a reason you keep moving. Not just because life demands it, not just because you have responsibilities, but because stopping feels uncomfortable in a way that is hard to explain. When everything is in motion, you feel in control. You feel productive. You feel like you are doing something that matters. But the moment things slow down, something else begins to surface. Thoughts you have been avoiding. Questions you have been postponing. Feelings that do not disappear just because you stay busy. And that is where the real tension begins. Because slowing down is not just about doing less. It is about facing what has been waiting underneath everything you have been doing. This is why silence can feel so heavy. It removes distractions. It removes the constant input that keeps your mind occupied. And when that happens, you are left with yourself in a way that feels unfamiliar. You start to notice things you did not want to notice. You start to feel things you tried to push aside. And in that space, there is no quick escape. So you speed back up. You reach for your phone, your tasks, your routines, anything that brings back movement, because movement feels safer than stillness. It gives you something to focus on, something to control, something to hold on to. But what if that constant movement is the very thing keeping you stuck? What if the answers you have been searching for are not found in doing more, but in allowing yourself to be still long enough to hear what has been there all along? This is where fear becomes subtle. It does not show up as panic. It shows up as avoidance. You tell yourself you do not have time to slow down. You convince yourself that you need to keep going, or everything will fall behind. You justify the noise because it feels necessary. But underneath all of that, there is something deeper. A fear that if you truly stop, you might have to confront truths that will change the direction of your life. And that kind of change feels uncertain. It challenges the plans you made. It questions the path you have been following. It asks you to trust something that does not come with guarantees. So you stay in motion. Not because it is the best option, but because it is the most familiar one. And this is how disconnection continues. Not through lack of desire, but through lack of stillness. Because the space where clarity begins is the same space you have been avoiding. Not because it is empty, but because it is honest. And honesty has a way of revealing things you cannot ignore once you see them. But here is what you need to understand. Slowing down is not losing progress. It is correcting direction. It is the moment where you stop reacting and start becoming aware. Where you stop chasing answers and start recognizing what has already been placed in front of you. And yes, it feels uncomfortable at first, because you are stepping out of noise and into something real. But if you stay there long enough, something begins to change. The discomfort starts to fade. The confusion starts to settle. And in that stillness, something becomes clear in a way that cannot be forced. Not loud, not overwhelming, just steady. And once you experience that, you begin to understand something most people never allow themselves to discover. That what you have been avoiding might actually be what you need the most. And what comes next will make that even more undeniable. Because that confusion you have been trying to escape might not be a problem at all. It might be carrying a meaning you have not considered yet. The hidden meaning behind your confusion. You have been treating confusion like an obstacle, something to eliminate as quickly as possible. You want clarity, direction, certainty. You want to know what to do next so you can move forward without hesitation. But what if confusion is not the problem? What if confusion is the process? That idea changes everything, because instead of asking, how do I escape this feeling, you begin to ask, what is this trying to show me? Confusion does not appear randomly. It shows up when something you believed no longer aligns with something deeper that you are beginning to sense. It is the space between what you used to be certain about and what you are not fully ready to understand yet. And that space feels unstable, because you can no longer rely on old answers, but you do not yet have new ones that feel solid. So you feel stuck in between, not fully connected to where you were, not fully clear about where you are going. That is where most people panic. They rush to replace confusion with quick answers. They look for immediate direction, something that removes the discomfort. They force decisions just to feel movement again. But forced clarity is not real clarity. It is just an escape from uncertainty. And that is why it never lasts. Because the moment you avoid confusion instead of understanding it, you also avoid the transformation it is trying to create. Confusion slows you down for a reason. It interrupts patterns that you would otherwise continue without questioning. It creates a pause between impulse and action. It gives you space to see what you could not see before, but only if you allow it. If you resist it, it feels like chaos. If you stay with it, it becomes awareness. And awareness changes how you move. Instead of reacting immediately, you begin to observe. Instead of trying to control the outcome, you begin to understand the process. Instead of asking, "What should I do next?" you begin to ask, "What is no longer true for me?" That question is powerful, because confusion is often a sign that something is ending internally before something new begins. A belief is shifting, a direction is being questioned, an identity is evolving. And that does not happen comfortably. It happens in uncertainty. So when you feel confused, it does not mean you are lost. It means you are no longer able to pretend that everything is clear when it is not. It means you are becoming aware of something deeper than the surface-level direction you have been following. And that awareness is the beginning of real change. But here is the part that requires trust. You will not always understand the meaning of confusion while you are inside it. Clarity often comes after you move through it, not before. And that is what makes it difficult. Because you are being asked to stay present in a space that does not give you immediate answers. You are being asked to listen without fully knowing what you are listening for. You are being asked to trust without having full proof. And that goes against everything you have been taught. But if you can stay with it, something begins to shift. Patterns become visible. Feelings start to make sense. Direction begins to emerge, not as a sudden answer, but as a quiet certainty that builds over time. And once that happens, you start to see confusion differently. Not as something that blocks your path, but as something that reveals it. And what you are about to understand next will take that even further. Because sometimes, what feels like confusion is not just internal. Sometimes it is the result of something outside of you being intentionally redirected. Something that did not go the way you planned. Something that forced you to stop. And that might not have been random at all. When God interrupts your plans, you had a plan. It made sense. It was structured. It followed a logic that felt safe and predictable. You knew where you were going, or at least you believed you did. Every step was leading somewhere. Every decision was building towards something you could see in your mind. And then something interrupted it. Not in a small way. Not in a way you could easily adjust and move on. Something shifted. Something stopped. Something did not unfold the way you expected. And suddenly, what once felt certain became unclear. At first, you tried to fix it. You looked for alternatives, new strategies, different paths that could bring you back to where you thought you should be. You told yourself this was just a delay, just a temporary obstacle, something you could work around if you tried hard enough. But the more you tried to force it, the more resistance you felt, because not every interruption is meant to be solved. Some are meant to be understood. And this is where the perspective begins to change. You see interruptions as problems because they break your expectations. They disrupt your timeline. They take you out of control and place you in uncertainty. And uncertainty feels uncomfortable because it does not give you immediate answers. But what if the interruption is the answer? What if the thing that did not work out is the very thing that kept you from going in the wrong direction? That idea is difficult to accept, especially when you invested time, energy, and belief into a specific outcome. Letting go of that expectation feels like losing something important. But sometimes what you lose externally protects you internally. Not every closed door is a mistake. Not every delay is a failure. Not every change in direction is a setback. Some are redirections that you would have never chosen on your own. Because if everything always went according to your plan, you would never question whether your plan was right to begin with. You would keep moving forward, assuming that progress equals alignment. But progress without alignment leads to distance. And that distance is what creates the feeling of being lost. So when something interrupts your path, it forces you to pause. It forces you to look again. It forces you to reconsider what you were so certain about. And that pause is where awareness begins. Not because everything suddenly makes sense, but because you are no longer moving blindly in a direction that might not be meant for you. This is where trust becomes real. Not when everything is working, not when everything is clear, but when something does not go your way and you still choose to believe that there is a purpose behind it. That does not mean ignoring your emotions. It does not mean pretending that disappointment does not exist. It means being willing to see beyond the immediate outcome, to consider that what feels like an obstacle might actually be guidance in a form you did not expect. And this is where many people miss what is happening. They focus so much on what was interrupted that they fail to see what is being redirected. Because when one path closes, attention naturally goes to what was lost. But direction is found in what is opening, even if it is not obvious yet. And that requires a different kind of awareness, the kind that does not cling to what should have happened, but becomes open to what is actually unfolding. Because if you can shift your focus in that way, something begins to change. Frustration starts to turn into curiosity. Resistance starts to turn into observation. And slowly, what once felt like disruption begins to reveal a different kind of direction. One that you did not plan, but one that might be more aligned than anything you could have forced. And what you are about to understand next will make that even clearer. Because the feeling of being lost has never been what you thought it was. The truth about feeling lost. You have been using the word lost as if it means something is wrong with you, as if it represents failure, confusion without purpose, a lack of direction that needs to be fixed as quickly as possible. You treat it like a condition you should not be in, like a sign that you made the wrong choices or that you are falling behind. But what if that definition is completely wrong? What if feeling lost is not a mistake, but a necessary part of becoming aware of something deeper? Because think about it carefully. You can only feel lost when something you used to rely on no longer gives you clarity. A belief stops making sense. A direction stops feeling right. A version of your life no longer feels aligned with who you are becoming. That is not failure. That is transition. But transitions do not feel stable. They do not give you clear answers right away. They remove certainty before they replace it with something new. And that is why they feel uncomfortable. You are no longer who you were, but you are not yet fully who you are becoming. And in that space, everything feels unclear. That is the moment most people resist. They try to go back to what felt certain, even if it no longer fits. They try to force clarity by making quick decisions, just to escape the discomfort of not knowing. But the truth is, you are not supposed to rush this part, because this is where realignment happens. Feeling lost forces you to question what you would otherwise continue without thinking. It interrupts automatic patterns. It creates distance between you and the things that no longer serve you. It slows you down enough to see what you could not see before. And that is where something important begins. Because when everything feels clear too quickly, you do not look deeper. You just continue. But when clarity is removed, you are pushed into awareness. You start asking different questions. Not what is the fastest way forward, but what is actually true for me now. Not what should I be doing, but what no longer feels right. And those questions change everything, because they move you away from external expectations and closer to internal alignment. That is why feeling lost can be one of the most honest states you can experience. It removes illusions. It exposes what is no longer working. It brings you face to face with the reality that something needs to shift. And that realization is not comfortable, but it is necessary. Because without it, you would keep moving in directions that feel right on the surface, but are disconnected underneath. You would keep building a life that looks complete, but feels empty. So feeling lost is not the end of direction. It is the end of false direction. And that distinction matters. Because once you understand that, you stop trying to escape the feeling. You start listening to it. You start recognizing that it is pointing somewhere. even if you cannot fully see where yet. And that changes how you respond. Instead of reacting with fear, you begin to observe with awareness. Instead of forcing answers, you allow them to unfold. Instead of assuming something is wrong, you begin to consider that something is actually being revealed. And once that shift happens, you are no longer in the same position. You are no longer just lost. You are in the process of being redirected. And what you are about to see next will challenge you even more. Because if feeling lost is not a mistake, then there is another possibility you have not fully considered yet. The possibility that where you are right now is not random at all. What if this is exactly where you're meant to be? You have been looking at your current situation as something temporary, something to escape, something to fix as quickly as possible. You keep thinking about where you should be instead of fully seeing where you are. But what if this moment is not a mistake? What if this is not a detour, not a delay, not something that went wrong, but a precise point in your life that holds a purpose you have not understood yet? That idea is uncomfortable because it removes the assumption that everything would feel clear if you were in the right place. It challenges the belief that purpose always feels obvious, that direction always feels certain, that being aligned always feels easy. But what if alignment sometimes feels like uncertainty? What if being exactly where you are meant to be does not come with immediate clarity, but with a process that prepares you for something you are not ready to handle yet? Because if you think about it, clarity without preparation can lead to the wrong decisions. If you were given everything you think you want right now, without the internal alignment to sustain it, you would either lose it or turn it into something it was never meant to be. So instead of rushing you forward, something is holding you here, not to stop you, but to shape you. And shaping does not always feel comfortable. It often feels like waiting, like not having answers, like being in a place that does not fully make sense yet. And that is where doubt begins to grow. You question your path. You question your decisions. You question whether you are falling behind while everything around you seems to keep moving. But what if you are not behind? What if you are being positioned? Positioned in a way that cannot be rushed, cannot be forced, cannot be skipped. Because certain things require a specific version of you, a level of awareness, of understanding, of internal clarity that cannot be developed through shortcuts. And that is what this moment is creating. Even if you cannot see it clearly, even if it feels like nothing is happening. Because growth is not always visible. Preparation is not always obvious, and direction is not always loud. But that does not mean it is not there. It means it is unfolding in a way that requires trust instead of proof. And that is where most people struggle. They want confirmation before they believe. They want clarity before they trust. They want to see the outcome before they commit to the process. But that is not how this works. Because if you could see everything clearly, you would not need to trust anything beyond yourself, and that would keep you limited to what you already know. But where you are being guided requires more than that. It requires you to accept that not understanding everything does not mean you are in the wrong place. It means you are in a place where understanding is still being formed. And once you begin to see it that way, something shifts. The urgency to escape starts to fade. The pressure to have everything figured out begins to loosen. And in that space, a different kind of awareness starts to emerge. You stop asking, how do I get out of here? And you begin asking, what is this moment trying to build in me? That question changes your relationship with everything you are experiencing. Because now, instead of resisting the present, you start engaging with it. Instead of seeing it as an obstacle, you begin to see it as preparation. And that does not mean everything suddenly becomes easy. It means everything starts to make more sense over time. But there is still one thing that holds most people back, even when they begin to understand this. Something that keeps them searching instead of trusting. something that makes them overlook what has been right in front of them the entire time. And what you are about to see next will bring that into focus in a way you cannot ignore. The voice you've been ignoring. There is a voice that has been present through every moment you just reflected on. Not loud, not demanding, not forcing your attention, but steady in a way that does not disappear even when everything else changes. It has been there in your uncertainty, in your decisions, in your hesitation, in your silence, and yet you have learned to overlook it, not because it is unclear, but because it does not sound like everything else you are used to listening to. It does not rush you. It does not pressure you. It does not create fear to make you act. Instead, it speaks in a way that requires you to slow down enough to recognize it. And that is why it is so often ignored. Because you have been trained to respond to urgency, to react to noise, to follow what feels immediate. You have been taught to trust what is loud, what is repeated, what is reinforced by everything around you. But this voice does not operate that way. It does not compete. It waits. It waits for a moment where you are not distracted, where you are not overwhelmed, where you are not trying to control everything at once. And when that moment happens, even briefly, you feel it. Not as words at first, but as a sense of clarity that does not need explanation. A quiet certainty that something is right or something is not. A direction that does not come from overthinking but from knowing. You have felt it before. In moments where you knew you should walk away but stayed. In moments where you felt peace about something that did not make sense logically. In moments where you hesitated without knowing why, and later realized that hesitation protected you. That was not random. That was not coincidence. That was guidance. But here is where it becomes difficult. Recognizing that voice is one thing. Trusting it is another. Because trusting it means going against what is comfortable. It means stepping away from what looks right on the outside, but feels wrong on the inside. It means choosing a path that might not be understood by others. It means letting go of control in areas where you have always relied on certainty. And that requires courage. Not loud, dramatic courage, but quiet, consistent courage. The kind that shows up in small decisions. The kind that chooses alignment over approval. The kind that listens even when there is no immediate confirmation. And this is why so many people ignore it, not because they do not hear it, but because following it changes things. It challenges patterns, it shifts direction, it asks for trust in a way that cannot be measured or proven instantly, so it becomes easier to go back to noise, to return to what feels familiar, even if it is not aligned, to keep searching externally instead of listening internally. But the truth remains the same. That voice has not stopped. It has not become weaker. It has not disappeared. It is still there, waiting for you to recognize it again. Not as something distant, but as something that has been with you the entire time. And once you truly see that, something changes. Because now the question is no longer, where is the guidance? The question becomes, why have I been ignoring what I already sensed? And that realization leads to a shift that cannot be undone. Because once you recognize the voice, you cannot pretend it is not there anymore. You can choose not to follow it, but you cannot say you did not feel it. And what comes next is where everything begins to realign in a way that feels different. Not forced, not rushed, but grounded in something deeper than anything you have been holding onto before. The shift from searching to trusting. There comes a point where searching starts to feel exhausting. Not because you lack effort, not because you are not trying hard enough, but because something inside you begins to realize that more searching is not bringing more clarity. You keep looking for answers in new places, new ideas, new directions, hoping that something will finally make everything clear. But instead of clarity, you find more options, more perspectives, more things to consider. And slowly, searching turns into overload. Because every new answer creates another question. Every new direction creates another possibility. And instead of feeling guided, you feel pulled in multiple directions at once. That is when something begins to shift. Not outside of you, but within you. You start to recognize that what you are looking for is not missing. It is just not being trusted. Because if you are honest, there have been moments where you already sensed the right direction. Moments where something felt clear, even if it did not make complete sense.
Moments where you knew what to do, but hesitated because it did not come with guarantees. And in those moments, you chose to keep searching instead of trusting. Not because you were wrong, but because trusting felt too uncertain. Searching feels active. It feels like progress. It gives you the illusion that you are getting closer. But trust feels different. It feels like stepping forward without having every detail figured out. It feels like letting go of the need to control every outcome.
It feels like moving with a quiet certainty that does not need constant validation. And that is uncomfortable at first, because it removes the safety of endless preparation. It removes the idea that you need one more answer before you act. It removes the belief that clarity must come before movement. But here is what changes everything. Real clarity does not come from gathering more information. It comes from recognizing what already resonates and choosing to follow it. And that is where trust begins. Not as a feeling that appears suddenly, but as a decision. A decision to stop looking everywhere else for what you have already sensed within yourself. A decision to act on what feels aligned, even if it is not fully explained. A decision to move forward without needing everything to be certain. And once you make that shift, something unexpected happens. The noise starts to lose its influence. The pressure to figure everything out begins to fade. And in its place, something more stable starts to grow. Not loud, not overwhelming, but steady. A sense of direction that builds as you move, not before. A clarity that strengthens through action, not hesitation. And this is where the cycle finally breaks. Because as long as you keep searching, you remain dependent on something outside of you to confirm your next step. But when you start trusting, you reconnect with something that has been consistent all along. Something that does not change based on opinions, trends, or external pressure. Something that does not need to prove itself to be real. And that changes how you move. You stop reacting. You start aligning. You stop forcing. You start allowing. And most importantly, you stop feeling lost. Not because you suddenly know everything, but because you are no longer disconnected from what guides you. And once that happens, everything you experienced before begins to make sense in a different way. Because you realize something that changes the entire meaning of your journey. You were never searching for a path. You were learning how to trust the one that was already there. And what comes next will bring everything together in a way that leaves no doubt. You were never lost, just being led. Everything you have felt up to this point begins to reorganize when you see this clearly. You were never moving without direction. You were never abandoned. You were never left to figure everything out on your own. What you experienced as confusion, delay, silence, and uncertainty was never the absence of guidance. It was the presence of a process you did not fully understand while you were inside of it. Because being led does not always feel like certainty. Sometimes it feels like interruption. Sometimes it feels like waiting. Sometimes it feels like losing what you thought you needed. And sometimes it feels like being completely lost. But that does not mean you were without direction. It means the direction was not under your control. And that is what made it difficult to recognize. You were expecting a path that you could predict, manage, and fully understand before taking the next step. But what you were given instead was something that required trust before clarity. And because of that, you interpreted the experience as being lost. But look at everything now. The moments that slowed you down forced you to see what you were ignoring. The confusion made you question what no longer aligned. The interruptions prevented you from continuing in directions that were not meant for you. The silence created space for something deeper to be heard. None of that is random. None of that is meaningless. Every part of it shaped how you see, how you decide, how you move. And most importantly, it brought you to a point where you are no longer just reacting to life. You are aware of it. That awareness is the difference between drifting and being guided. Because when you are unaware, you move without understanding. But when you are aware, even uncertainty has direction. And that is what changes everything. You do not need to have every answer. You do not need to see the entire path. You do not need to eliminate every doubt before you move forward. Because you are not leading this alone. You never were. And once you accept that, the pressure begins to fade. The need to control every outcome becomes less intense. The fear of making the wrong decision starts to lose its power, because you begin to understand that direction is not something you create from nothing. It is something you recognize, step by step, as you move. And even when it does not feel clear, even when it does not feel easy, even when it does not feel the way you expected, it is still there. Steady, consistent, unchanged by your moments of doubt. So the next time you feel that sense of being lost, do not rush to escape it. Pause. Pay attention. Because that feeling might not be telling you that you are off track. It might be reminding you that you are not in control of everything, and that is not a weakness. It is the very reason you are being guided. And if this message reached you at this exact moment, then this is not something to ignore. Not because of coincidence, but because you are ready to see what has been true the entire time. You were never lost, you were being led.